Secretary Ken Cuccinelli with the Department of Homeland Security joins us via the phone. Sir, always good to have you on the show, and thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate you.
No, my pleasure, as always.
Of course. So to say that you've been busy is like the understatement of the year, I think, because now here we're going into the home stretch towards the election. And I know that one of the hot topics, and this is something that we've seen even while we have the violence and the riots in the streets, we also have Democrats and surrogates, their activists, et cetera, out there saying that it's, they're worried about the integrity of the vote, and we need everyone to vote by mail, and our people are going to be safe voting. What problems are you anticipating, and how are you responding as Americans gear up to vote this November?
Well, first, if I could, just, I've been listening to your show here for a little while, and the comments Joe Biden made, I just have to, there wasn't a single thing about Lafayette Park he said that's right. I just want people to know that for sure, because that involved the Department of Homeland Security. We were responsible for that. But when it comes to the election itself, first of all, it's important for people to understand who's responsible for what. Poll security and physical security, including of ballots, are state and local authorities. What we at the federal level are protecting is on the cyber side. And we have done, and this isn't just us, but we've done a better job in this election cycle than ever before. Now, as more and more people shift from in-person voting to on paper, whether that's absentee or because states use paper ballot trails, which are more auditable, then the risk moves from the online arena to these in-person paper ballot systems. And one of the great insulations we have against interference in our elections is that every state does it differently. As we like to say, if you've seen one state's election system, you've seen one state's election system. So the idea that that any actor could just create a system of fraud and then deploy it nationwide is fanciful. Let's start with the nation-state actors. There is not only no evidence of interference with election systems, as much as you hear about Russia, they're doing all the influence stuff on social media and other things, but so's Iran, so's China. But what they're not doing is what they did in 2016. In 2016, they were trying to get into the infrastructure. And we have such a sentinel system and are so much better off in terms of cooperation with all 50 states, regardless of whether you have Republican or Democrat secretaries of state. They're all tied into what's called CISA in the Department of Homeland Security, a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. And that is so much better than 2016. We're in a pretty good place. To the extent, now look, I was a state attorney general. I'm familiar with doing enforcement on fraud, and I'm not here to tell you there won't be any. But to the extent it happens, it's going to be sort of the old traditional localized undertakings are what we would most expect, and the federal government doesn't have a role in policing that. That's state and local officials. But that's partly because at the federal level, across the whole government, we've done a good job of keeping an eye on the foreign adversaries and boxing them out and, frankly, punching back in some instances. So we're in a good place in 2020.
And that's good to hear as well. And I also love because you have to hold a firm line on this. And you mentioned again briefly when you were talking about how DHS was involved there as it related to the president going to the church, which I actually thought was great. And everyone that I know that listens to the program across the country thought it was great as well, and they realized what was being done. But it was amazing to me how people were more upset over that than the fact that here you had a violent Marxist mob that had set the same church on fire literally the day before. And people were more upset that Trump visited the church than they were over the fact that we are now here in 2020 people are burning churches if they're not knocking down statues, like the St. Peter's Basilica, knocking down statues at churches. They're setting churches on fire. Let me ask you this, because we've always had unrest, particularly around elections. We had Occupy Wall Street. We've had, even before that, way back in the 60s, you had Weather Underground. Is this an intensification from what we've seen previously in our nation's history?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about Occupy stuff, those were protests in cities that were addressing, like income inequality. Of course, they were against capitalism, which we're seeing again. It's a common theme, but the breadth of it across the country in what I'll call unorganized, in the sense of there's no overarching organization. This is sort of organically, as best we can see. There's plenty that can be done encrypted that we can't see. All over the country. I mean, if this is in Kenosha and Lancaster and Rochester, that's not New York, Chicago, LA.
Yeah.
That's sort of every town USA. And that's a concern. It's one the president has been very vociferous in, demanding that first priority of government be performed by these local and state governments, and that's public safety, law and order. And you achieve that goal of peace through strength. Peace through strength isn't just when we're facing off with the Soviet Union under Ronald Reagan. It's true in every community. And if you look at Portland, where they refuse to use their strength, versus Kenosha, where at first the governor declined the president's urging to bring in National Guard, and the president offered to bring them from other states. And then there was deaths, literally, and more violence, and Governor Evers changed his mind and agreed with the president and cooperated. And what happened? Peace is what happened. Peace was restored to that community. And that's in a situation where something like half the arrests were from people not from the Kenosha area. They were traveling to be violent. And so the president's approach works.
Right.
If leaders in communities will just set aside their petty little partisan politics and do their job of keeping their own community safe. This is a president willing to give them the tools, but he's always going to stay within the boundaries of federal law, federal restrictions. We can't just go police communities.
Right.
We have restrictions on what we can do. But the president is willing to do everything that's within his authority, and he has, in fact, done it.
Yeah, and to that point, I always felt as though there were some Democrat mayors and governors that were really trying to play a game of chicken with the administration and really bait them into going above and beyond what the scope of their authority, which, again, as you said, it didn't happen, and there's no desire from the administration for that to happen. One of the other things, just to pivot, that it obviously blew up and is trending today is the announcement that TikTok and WeChat, those are going to be, for the lack of a better way to put it, suspended. We're not going to be able to download. I don't have them, but people won't be able to download them. I think it's starting on Sunday, and this comes after the announcement that there's going to be a crackdown of goods that are produced in China's state-sponsored forced labor system, particularly the area where the Uyghurs are in prison, where their forced labor is being used to make goods. And this is something that has all come out within the past week. Tell me a little bit about this. And it is a little odd to me, and we were kind of laughing about it earlier, that there are people actually out there that are upset that they can't use it's a communist Chinese app. And I don't trust that app. I wouldn't trust it with my information. And it's amazing that there are some people so blinded by partisanship that they think that they can trust communist China more so than the administration.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think that Marxism is trying to make a comeback in this country.
Oh, yes.
You see that in a good chunk of the unrest, riots, and so forth. People who openly declare themselves Marxists. So, maybe they feel some camaraderie, to pick their words. But in the Xinjiang region of China, which is in the northwest part of the country, it's a fairly sizable region, not kind of sparsely populated. But in that region, the communist Chinese run literal concentration camps holding 1 to 3 million. You mentioned the Uyghur Muslims. There's also Turks in there, and there's others. But the Uyghurs are the biggest population, We have extensive evidence, as do many other countries and nonprofits, NGOs that have been gathered. Journalists have gathered enormous amounts of information about what amounts to a slave labor system they have out there, and with everything you'd expect to go along with it, beating, sexual violence, lack of freedom of movement, among other things, one-child policies, et cetera. And this week, Customs Border Protection in the Department of Homeland Security issued what are called WROs, withhold release orders, which blocks imports from these 5 entities into the United States, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of trade annually. These are just the latest from CBP. We have done all the way back into the last fiscal year. You've seen the Trump administration be the most aggressive administration this century in fighting this forced labor by the communist Chinese. And we're not done yet. These aren't things we turn around in days. These have been months and years-long investigations, and the fruit of them is blocking these companies access to the U.S. market. And like I said, you can expect this to continue with other companies as well. We, earlier in the summer, with the Departments of State, Labor, and Treasury, issued a business advisory publicly advising American and international companies to get out of their business ties to the Xinjiang region because it is so rife with slave labor, which is, of course, illegal. It makes it impossible for American workers to compete. It makes it difficult for American companies to compete. And it's pure inhumanity in the 21st century, I'm sorry, hearkening back to some of the worst features of the 20th century, is worthy of our moral outrage and our opposition.
Yeah,
and this
absolutely.
president has been very aggressive in pushing us forward in this direction.
We're talking with Acting Deputy Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli. One last quick question for you, Ken, on that topic, because one of the things that always comes up is, and I understand the difference, when you have a national security issue, and especially as it relates to a foreign entity. What do you tell individuals who say, well, the government shouldn't be telling people what apps they can and cannot download, or businesses who they can and cannot do business with? What is the response to that? Because I know that, ideologically you agree with these individuals in terms of, being a Republican or being a conservative. But what do you tell people who bring that up?
Yeah, and I'd go even farther. I'm kind of on that border between libertarian and conservative. I'm very free market oriented, and I'm very sympathetic to the ideals that inspire those kinds of comments. However, we do know that the Communist Chinese government uses every single company that does business here. They maintain legal authority to gather any and all of their information. That's in China law.
Right.
And so TikTok ends up, just among others, people should think about downloading games from China. Once you've done that onto your laptop is owned by the Chinese military and intelligence service. That has national security implications that are relevant to the whole country and really the whole world. So when you have that competition between the national security needs of the country and the individual freedom of individuals, now we're not obviously invading your liberty in the sense of telling you what to do. We are making unavailable TikTok, and soon other things could be added to that list, because we are determined to not let the Chinese intelligence service and military have access to such easy intelligence information. Everybody listening to your show should know the Chinese probably already have hacked your your credit scores.
Lovely.
They've gathered personal information on so many of us.
Facial recognition, the facial mapping.
Yeah, that's certainly what they're doing in their own country, and there's nothing to keep them from doing that in other countries. I mean, you talk about, we're starting to get into Big Brother movies.
Oh, yeah.
Here,
It's turning into that.
That's right. And so when people who object to us barring TikTok, and this is
Right.
the president's decision.
Right.
There are very good national security reasons to do that.
Exactly. Unfortunately,
And,
we're out of time
they
here,
go
but we're
beyond
talking
person.
acting Deputy Secretary of Department of Homeland Security Ken Cuccinelli. We could talk about these issues for the rest of the show because there are so many of them. But we'd love to talk with you again. You're welcome back anytime. And we know there's not
My
going to be
pleasure.
any shortage of topics. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.